with that in mind, then we're going to go to our first speaker, and that's my colleague Ian Walsh, who's a lecturer in drama and theatre studies here at NUI Galway. There he is. Hi, Ian. Ian holds PhD from UCD and a certificate in directing from NUI Maynooth, and has worked as a freelance director of both theatre and opera. He's published very widely on Irish theatre. I'm sure many of you will know his book, Experimental Theatre After W.B. Yeats, from 2012. He's also co-edited volumes on Enda Walsh, and very recently, the book that Ruud just showed us, Cultural Convergence. He was a theatre reviewer for Irish Theatre Magazine, a publication that he was also the general manager for, and has worked for RTE's Arts Show and Arena as well. Here in Galway, he's the lead academic representative for really interesting and exciting Creative Europe projects with Galway Community Circus called Wires Crossed and Circus Plus Plus. So let me then hand over to Ian. Ian, I think you want to share a screen as well. So I'm going to turn my video off and I will hand it over to you now.
Yes, hello everyone. Just bear with me for 1 minute while I try to share my screen. I'll just change this, hold on, it'll... sorry, Sarah. Oh no, here we go. There we go. It's there. Can we all see that? Hopefully we can. Good. So I shall begin. So the title of my paper is Commedia dell'arte and the Gate Theatre. So from its foundation in 1928 onwards, the Commedia dell'arte was consciously adopted as representative of the type of performance that the principal directors Micheál, McLiammoir and Hilton Edwards wished to produce for the Gate Theatre. This is most obvious in McLiammoir's logo design for the theatre that depicts Harlequin opening up the gates of comedy. Hold on, have I just realized that I might be on mute? No, I'm not. Okay, sorry. This is most obviously in McLiammoir's logo design for the theatre that depicts Harlequin opening up the gates of comedy and tragedy in Hilton Edwards' book on stagecraft, The Mantle of Harlequin, where in the second half of the book, Edwards delivers his views on the art of theatre by imagining Harlequin dispensing advice for an inquisitive amateur. In its emphasis on the professional, the international, and the queer, Edwards and McLiammoir found the Commedia dell'arte to be an ideal theatrical precedent for their own ambitions in the practice of acting, design, direction, and playwriting. Adopting it as a model also served to mark the Gate as a new and different theatrical venture in Ireland, where the national and literary concerns of the Abbey Theatre had come to dominate. For the Commedia dell'arte was a performance-based tradition without scripts and a European-wide practice. Originating in Italy in the 16th century, but then spreading throughout the continent as it traveled and evolved over the centuries. Its conventions and characters became altered to suit the tastes and demands of audiences from the various countries where it was performed over many different epochs. Many of the stock characters were adopted and developed, most notably by French Romanticism in the 19th century, with Harlequin, Columbina, and Piero in particular becoming popular subjects of literature, painting, and performance, representing beauty, rebellion against religious and moral conformity, and genius. Whilst modernist artists and writers led by a new vibrant theatrical avant-garde in early 20th century Russia saw the form of Commedia and its characters as responsive to the effects of mass industrialization on human behavior in their inventiveness, contradiction, and alienation. J. Douglas Clayton writes of how the Commedia dell'arte is now at once a motif, a set of themes, a style, a theatrical program, a motley group of images, a metaphor. It is for him not one phenomenon, but a series of interconnected ones, some reinforcing each other, others distancing themselves. Indeed, it is its very immutability that made it attractive to artists such as McLiammoir and Edwards. For these two men, the Commedia dell'arte functioned to encapsulate their artistic values, presented a model of practice, and offered them a queer space of belonging in which to invent themselves. It is thus my aim here to trace the origins of their engagement with and conception of the Commedia dell'arte, and how this then manifested in their writings and theatre practice. So to begin, I wish to chart the influences on these two men in regard to Commedia dell'arte in order to attempt to qualify their particular conceptualization of the art form. So neither McLiammoir nor Edwards studied the Commedia in Italy or under an Italian Commedia practitioner. Their exposure to the form chiefly comes from its representation and reinterpretation in works of international modernism, and its continued presence in the English theatre through variety and pantomime traditions. In his practice, writings, and in the writings about him by McLiammoir, we know that Edwards was a keen follower and later proponent of the modernist movement to re-theatricalize the theatre that began in the early 20th century, led by directors like Meyerhold in Russia, Max Reinhardt in Germany, Gaston Batty in France, and Edward Gordon Craig in Britain. All of these practitioners rejected dominant modes of psychological verisimilitude and photographic realism on stage in favor of methods designed to more directly engage audiences in the performance event. As such, they strove, as Edwards himself would put it, for the theatre to be, quote, intensely itself, and in order to give, quote, audiences something they cannot see or hear to better effect outside its walls. This movement to re-theatricalize the theatre through the international figures already mentioned took inspiration from the theatricality of the Commedia dell'arte. Clayton writes that the Commedia had a semiotic function for such artists, signifying their, quote, allegiance to the revolution in theatrical art, and that, quote, the lozenge-covered figure of Harlequin became a sort of icon of the modernist revolution. It is made clear by Edwards, writing in the Mantle of Harlequin, that it was the theatricality of the Commedia that attracted him to the form. He writes, quote, for me, these figures move in a world lit by spot and flood and footlights, where the night seems illuminated by a painted moon, where everything is as real as thinking makes it so, and where no sorrow long survives the fall of the curtain. Another means by which Edwards was exposed to and influenced by Commedia came via his performances in Ronald Frankau's cabaret Kittens, which he described to designer Molly McEwen as a Pierrot show. He toured with this cabaret in England, Ireland, Scotland, and South Africa before joining Annie McMaster's repertory company and meeting McLiammoir. He considered the experience formative, writing, cabaret brought home to me the tremendous power of direct contact with the audience, which became less in the theatre with its remoteness. And I felt that the technique of the variety stage would help to bridge this gap. I consider the variety stage to be the only legitimate theatre. I've been greatly influenced by this experience. However, when writing directly on his conception of the Commedia dell'arte in the Mantle of Harlequin, Edwards does not mention the modernist directors and artists that previously mentioned, or the English variety stage. He writes, when I imagine Harlequin, Columbine, the Doctor, Pulcinella, Pantaloon, and all their crew, it is not only as the actors of the old Italian comedy that I see them, neither do I feel much affinity with those pale shadows of themselves that they became when, as an afterthought of that uniquely English invention, the pantomime, for here they appear like cut flowers, decorative but rootless. I think rather of the characters that were recreated by Fokine for the music of Schumann's Carnaval. Or it may be of those earlier Fêtes Galantes by Watteau, in which we find the ancient comrades Gallicized, and one of them reborn in France as Pierrot. The reference to the Ballet Russe production of Carnaval, choreographed by Fokine, with music by Schumann, links Edwards' conception of Commedia to that of McLiammoir. There are few references to the Commedia in McLiammoir's writings, but there are several mentions of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. His admiration for the designs of Léon Bakst and his fanaticism for the dancer Nijinsky, particularly his performance of Harlequin in Carnaval. We also see the influence of Léon Bakst's costume design of Harlequin and McLiammoir's own designs. In the logo for the Gate Theatre, the illustration of Harlequin in the Mantle of Harlequin, and the costume design for Truffaldino for the Gate production of The Servant of Two Masters. In McLiammoir's own final play, Prelude in Casbeck Street, we also follow the tragic love life of an Irish ballet dancer who is performing a revival of Nijinsky's dances with the Ballet Russe in Paris. And he's described in the stage directions at one point as moving like Nijinsky's Harlequin. Clearly then, Carnaval serves both men as a touchstone for their conception of the Commedia, an ideal model of practice for the type of theatre they wish to make. The production itself of Carnaval was full of theatricality, with the bright costumes of BAKST'S, and as a dance piece featuring the Commedia masks of Harlequin, Pierrot, Columbina, and Pantaloon among a series of lovers or inamorati, it emphasized theatre's origins in the moving body rather than in the spoken word. And it was international in being a ballet choreographed and performed by Russian dancers to the music of a German composer, with characters from the Italian comedy and also featuring the later French character mask of Pierrot. It was performed by professionals and executed with precision. It was modern in its presentation and style of movement, And it was also homoerotic and queer in its challenge to heteronormativity through its emphasis on the dynamic male body as spectacle, through the dancing of the harlequin and the effeminacy, sensitivity, and somewhat inefficacy of the Piero. So I wish now to elaborate on this aspect of the Commedia and how the character masks of Harlequin and Piero can be considered in relation to McLiammoir and Edward's queer identity. The sexually ambiguous English Alfred Wilmore's reinvention of himself as the Irishman Micheál McLiammoir has been considered as originating in the work of W.B. Yeats and Oscar Wilde, with their interest in masks. Wilde's famous aphorism in The Artist's Critic that, quote, "Man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask and he will tell you the truth," has been read by many scholars as particularly apt for McLiammoir. Ivor Walsh tells us that his self-invention as a, quote, neo-Celtic thespian allowed him to don a Yeatsian mask, enabling him to dissent and separate himself from a British masculinist heterosexuality that viewed the homoeroticism of Wilde as suspect and questionable. Although Walsh points out that Wilde, quote, Wilde remained key in his success at maintaining this fictive persona, as McLiammoir continually engaged with Wilde's life and works through productions of his plays The Gate, his one-man show on the life of Wilde, The Importance of Being Oscar in 1960, and his book, An Oscar of No Importance in 68. But only Richard Pine has sought to consider McLiammoir's masked identity in terms of the Commedia, a form of theatre wherein masks are essential to its creation and vitality. Pine writes specifically of how McLiammoir absorbed into himself the character of Harlequin, as interpreted by Nijinsky in the Ballet Russe production of Carnival, and that, quote, "It was as Harlequin that he, McLiammoir, played Hamlet, Emmet, and Wilde." He goes on to write how he is convinced that Nijinsky's Harlequin in Carnival, quote, "strongly determined Alfred Wilmore towards the catalysis of the indefinite, amorphous, multi-character chameleon who is never entirely what he seems, who continually reshapes and represents himself so as never to be identified, denied, pinned down." I wish to further this work on McLiammoir and his masks of identity, but I wish to argue that both Edwards as well as McLiammoir adopted the masks of Harlequin and also Piero in their writing and performing in order to reveal and shape their queer identities. Edwards, a lifelong partner of McLiammoir, has rarely been written of in terms of masks, and certainly in comparison to McLiammoir, his self-invention was less extreme in that he never claimed to be of a different nationality. David Clare and Nicola Morris have pointed out that in Gate theatre studies, Edwards has been portrayed as almost excessively English. He is portrayed as a, quote, no-nonsense Englishman, in contrast to the, quote, elaborate pose of his partner as a romantic Irishman. Clare and Morris have revealed through their genealogical study that Edwards had an Irish-born grandfather on his mother's side, and would have these days been considered, quote, eligible to play for Ireland. This was something that Edwards rarely admitted to and seemed happy to admit, always stressing his international outlook when it came to theatre. In his book, Mantle of a Harlequin, he professes to adopting two masks taken from the Commedia dell'arte. He writes, "My role, it seems to me, has always been that of Piero, yet sometimes I cannot resist filching Harlequin's wand." Edwards' conception of Piero is that of the figure found in Carnival. In a section of the Mantle of Harlequin where he brings to mind all of the characters of the Commedia that haunt him, he sees before him the sad clown, quote, "Piero fumbles with his long, helpless sleeves to catch the butterfly, that when he has caught it, he no longer desires. It is no longer alive." This, of course, is the famous piece of stage business of Piero in Carnival, where he chases Papillon, the butterfly. Identifying himself as Piero in this instance casts Edwards as the opposite of Harlequin. This is made clear in the choreography of the ballet. Piero's sad and forlorn movements drag him to earth with his sleeves dusting the stage, while Harlequin jumps flamboyantly towards the heavens. Piero is costumed in white with a ghostly pallor, while Harlequin is distinctive in his vibrant, multicolored patchwork trousers. What links Harlequin and Piero is their queer theatricality. Although the Piero figure represents a different type of queer identity to the frenzied energy of the indefinite, amorphous, multi-character chameleon of Nijinsky's Harlequin. Clayton writes in his book, Piero in Petrograd, "Nothing seemed to incarnate better the essence of decadence than the moonstruck figure of Piero, inhabiting a bizarre night world signaled by his pallor and his infatuation with the moon. Androgynous, effeminate, yet potentially sadistic, Piero expressed the revolt of the decadents against all that was healthy, normal, and mediocre. In a word, he served to épater les bourgeois. Piero exhibited, flaunted even, all those characteristics that Max Nordau in his influential book condemned as degenerate. On the sexual level, there were in Piero strong hints of homosexuality. So it's tempting to imagine Edwards as the Piero to McLiammoir's Harlequin, defining the pair in terms of opposition, as was done in relation to Edwards' Englishness and McLiammoir's Irishness. But Edwards also put on the mask of Harlequin, as the title of his book suggests, The Mantle of Harlequin, while McLiammoir played a Piero on stage twice. Firstly, in his own translation of Lawrence Houseman and Granville Barker's Prunella for Untitled in 1928, and then later reprising the role in a Gate production of the play in 1945. In the program note for the 1945 production, it is stated that the play can be taken as, quote, a translation of the spirit and person of the Commedia dell'arte of Schumann's Carnival. Here then, the Piero of Granville Barker is made into that of the Piero of Carnival. Further to his time as a Piero with the Cabaret Kittens, Edwards also played Piero on stage in the prologue to the Gate review Harlequinade, produced at the Cork Opera House, the Gaiety Theatre, and the Gate in 1941 and 1942. Interestingly, this seems to be the only role the two ever shared in the entirety of their career. I'm sure all the Gate scholars out there now may correct me on that, but as far as I understand, I think that's the only time that they performed the same role. In their continued performances as Piero and Harlequin on stage and in their writing, Edwards and McLiammoir were able to imagine and embody publicly a theatricalized queer identity in a devoutly Catholic and conservative country, where homosexuality would only be decriminalized in 1993. When McLiammoir decided to write his play Prelude in Casbeck Street in 1973, 20 years before decriminalization, with a leading gay character, it is perhaps unsurprising that the play again returns to the imagery of the Carnival in order to navigate the representation of a queer identity. The plot revolves around the tragic love life of a lonely international ballet star who is Irish but performs under the Russian name of Serge Kovaleski, and continually falls for men ill-suited to him due to their brutality or their denial of their own homosexuality. His life thus feels like, quote, a prelude to something that never happens. As previously mentioned, the piece takes place in Paris as Serge dances a season of Ballet Russe revivals. He dances all the roles made famous by Nijinsky, but his confidant Maggie tells him that there is a shadow that comes over him after he plays the role of Harlequin in Carnival. This shadow reveals his loneliness and his inability to play the role of the Harlequin. He is instead a Piero figure who will continually chase that which he cannot have, like the moonstruck clown fumbling after the butterfly. I now wish to end by briefly looking at some of the productions that involved Commedia dell'arte. So although the influence of the Commedia on the works of Edwards and McLiammoir at the Gate was primarily in style and approach, with the odd short Commedia seen in Gate reviews such as Harlequinade, it was nevertheless engaged with more directly in two full productions. The first of these was the production of The Merchant of Venice, presented to the Gaiety in 1946, where Edwards transposed the play to 18th century Venice, with a cast of Commedia characters helping to stage the Bard's famous play. In a handbill advertising the Gate season, the production is described thus: the ingenious history of Portia and the Jew is offered as a bouquet by the figures of the Italian Commedia dell'arte, with Pieros, Columbine, Doctors, and Punchinellos, to say nothing of Harlequin, whose wand transforms the scenes from ghetto to palace and from canal-side streets to the gardens of Belmont, in full view of the audience. Here, Edwards and McLiammoir mix different styles and evolutions of the Commedia to serve their own aesthetic and solve issues of staging, and they were pleased with the result. In an article published in Shakespeare's Survey that takes the form of a conversation between Edwards and McLiammoir on issues of staging Shakespeare based on their experiences, McLiammoir claims the 1946 production of The Merchant of Venice to be their greatest triumph of all the Gate Shakespeare productions. He comments that it was, quote, by far the nearest approach to what we were both seeking than anything else that we have done. What both men sought was a production of Shakespeare where the words and deeds of the characters would directly impact upon a contemporary audience, engaging them afresh, free from the deadening cultural reference given to these texts. In the conversation, Edwards is not convinced the production was the final answer to the question of how to do the plays, but he does share, quote, a small satisfaction in remembering our merchant, especially the idea of having a band of actors who are in and yet not of the play to do the work usually allotted, in a childish hide behind the curtains secrecy that deceives nobody to the scene shifter. The presentation of Shakespeare's play as staged by Commedia characters in the 18th century added a level of playful theatricality to this tired piece, inviting the audience to join in a game of make-believe and thus liberating the staging from any need of verisimilitude. As already mentioned in Edwards' comments, the Commedia device allowed for quick transitions between scenes, which helped maintain an intensity in the performance, something which was for Edwards key to his directing approach. This aspect was also one that Seamus Kelly in the Irish Times was keen to commend about the production, writing how, quote, the charming harlequinade cum ballet sequences of the Commedia dell'arte proved to be an adroit expedient for bypassing those tedious Shakespeare scene changes, giving the play a speed, freshness, and colour. And for the reviewer in the Evening Herald, the transitions were a highlight. The transitions were also a highlight, but he writes further of, much visual beauty was achieved, especially in the trial and casket scenes. The outstanding scene, however, was that just before the interval, when Shylock, desolate over the disappearance of his daughter, was caught up in the mad whirl of the carnival. This is a brilliant piece of stagecraft that lodges itself in the memory. It lodged in McLiammoir's memory, who recalled, quote, what conviction there was in the scene where Shylock returns to find an empty house, fighting his way through the crowds of masked and garlanded revelers under showers of streamers and petals. McLiammoir and Edwards would go on to stage 2 more productions of The Merchant of Venice, but did not repeat the experiment of the 1946 production. A reason for this may have been that Edwards feared the dynamism and splendor of the movement and visual aspects of the Commedia inspired production came at the cost of a meaningful delivery of Shakespeare's verse. The newspaper reviews do mention the delivery of some of the lines to have been of poor standard. In a postscript, I'm not sure if people can read that, hopefully they can. In a postscript in a letter written to Jean Ann Crowley in 1973 before rehearsals began for another Gate production of The Merchant of Venice, Edwards was keen to communicate that the delivery of Shakespeare's lines be carefully considered, writing, I would like the verse to sound like verse, with much value given to its music, while remembering that it is not an opera and that it is full of good sense, which should be given its full value. In a word, I'm trying to hit a happy medium between the operatic hamming of the bad old days and the, to my mind, over-intellectualized, gasping astringency of the bad new days. The other most overt production in a Commedia style was the Gate production of Goldoni's The Servant of Two Masters in 1973. This show was an opportunity for Edwards to fully embrace the knockabout farce of Italian Commedia in his direction, and for McLiammoir to delight in the colour and playfulness of the period costuming. Little time to examine this production, but just to say that although critics enjoyed the slapstick comedy of the actors and the deft direction by Edwards, some sounded a sad note that the piece was not intellectually engaging. Goldoni's play and its borrowing of Commedia characters and Lazzi is often described as having marked the end of the Commedia by forcing its unruly nature into a stifling, indeed, literary form. And it seems that this production by the Gate, while competent, perhaps lacked the magic touch of Harlequin's wand that had been characteristic of so many Gate productions over the years. Thank you very much. Now I'll stop sharing my screen and I will hand over again to our chair. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Ian. And the sound of silence you're hearing is really the sound of applause. I'm sure one of the downsides of online conferences. So next up we have Martin, and I can see that Martin is with us. So Martin, I know you're going to, yes, there you are. You're going to need to turn on your camera, which you've done, and your mic, and I think you're going to share a screen as well. So just while Martin is doing that, I might just by way of introduction quickly say that Martin got in touch with us some time ago to tell us about his interest in particularly encore at the Gate and Irish language drama at the Gate. And, you know, we think, I suppose this is one of the really important features of the story of the Gate is that we see the theatre, especially with Edwards and McLiammoir, as being a cosmopolitan European theatre. And again, they saw the Irish language as being part of that cosmopolitanism. They saw the Irish language as being part of their approach to the broad European context of making theatre. And I think it's really important for us to get that story back in there. So delighted that Martin wants to talk about Encore Diarmuid at the Gate as well. When Martin wrote to us, he said that he's not an academic now, but he used to be. I think that's fair to say. And at the moment, he is working, negotiating on climate change in the EU. I think that's right to say, is it not? So thanks, Martin, for doing that important work on our behalf. Martin has a blog called hessionblog.wordpress.com. We can pop it in the chat in a moment. And do check it out, some lovely images and really interesting stuff there. So Martin, you're very welcome, and take it away.
Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you very much for the invite. As hinted at, I'm very much an amateur and possibly out of my depth. I read somewhere that Brian Friel said that neither McLiammoir nor Edwards ever worked with amateurs. I think we'll see that that's not entirely true. I hope you won't regret it. The other aspect here to be wary of is that there's a personal interest here, and that one of the characters that I'm going to talk about is a relative of whom I knew nothing. But the theme is the Irish language drama at the Gate from 1929 to 1934. And it's something that is not much remembered. It hasn't been completely forgotten, but it's not talked about a lot. There are seminal books out there that touch on the theatre, particularly Philip O'Leary's studies on Gaelic literature, and Professor Shiel, who's written an article in the forthcoming book on Garrod O'Loughlin, are prominent in remembering this time. It's a tale of three theatres in a way. Encore started in the Abbey in 1923, and of course McLiammoir and Edwards were instrumental in setting up Untitled in Galway in 1928, before returning to, before setting up the Gate Theatre in Dublin, and before Encore joined the Gate Theatre in 1929. It was described, the Irish theatre movement, as a wavering, ungovernable flame in McLiammoir's book on his theatrical experience in the 20s and 30s. O'Loughlin said that he had brought a professionalism and a technical and artistic sense to this theatre that had really made it flourish. McLiammoir himself, looking back at it, had a kind of a witch-like description of his powers in terms of invoking the spirit of the Irish language and calling it this ungovernable flame that flared up and faded back, a kind of a magical thing that he looked at. One other theme that's talked about quite a lot is that the theatre is a magical interaction of actor, author, and audience. And this is something that McLiammoir managed to catalyze. But many of the commentators say at the end of the period, towards the end of the 30s, that ultimately that interaction had failed, simply because there weren't very many actors, there wasn't a great audience, and there was a lack of authors, but we will see. We have seen also a kind of a reclaiming of two of the original directors of the Gate that have been somewhat forgotten. Elaine Sisson talked a lot about Daisy Coco Bernard and her background in cabaret and in presentation of pageants, etc., throughout the 20s. And it's written extensively on her. She was one of the original directors and brought with her book of club members from her cabaret as the initial startup to the Gate. And now we have Professor Shiel's article on the second face there, Garrod O'Loughlin, who is the Irish language theatre impresario who worked in Copenhagen at the beginning of the century and had advantages in film. And of course we have Micheál, who himself became not only Irish but Gaelic over the course of the decade, and Hilton Edwards. Forgive me, I'm just on, seem to be stuck. Of course, Michael was, and it strikes me when I look back at the area that he was a film star, a bit of a matinee star, and most of the descriptions and reviews of the Irish language theatre very much touch upon the glamour and the star quality that he brought to the productions. Right, sorry about that. So, but let's go back to the beginning. Encore was founded in 1923 at the beginning of the Free State in the aftermath of civil war. This group of individuals I'm going to explore for a while, but this is the first picture of them in 1923 in the Freeman's Journal, a rather formal picture of the members of the cast and the directors. And I'll go through them in detail. They played Irish theatre one night a week at the Abbey Theatre from 1923 until about 1928, moving to the Peacock during the period. Who were they? Well, most prominent among them was a man called Pierce Beasley, who Professor O'Sheedle has remembered in a large biography in Irish. He was quite an interesting figure in the sense that he was born in Liverpool, became involved in the Gaelic League, moved to Ireland, became a journalist, was elected a TD, fought in the War of Independence, was part of jailbreaks from 2 prisons, large jailbreaks, was a friend of Michael Collins and his biographer. He's not much remembered. I think he lost prominence and became unpopular over the period. Perhaps he was removed from the directorship of Ungovernable, and it wasn't much talked about in theatrical circles, but he was certainly the leading light of the theatre in its first years. Garrod O'Loughlin, who we've mentioned, and there's a chapter in the book, he was also born outside Ireland in Liverpool, but returned early, lived and worked as an agent of Sinn Féin in Copenhagen, and worked on the Danish theatre and an early Danish film from 1907 to about 1911. And he worked throughout the period and was one of the founders of the Gate Theatre, as I said. We have Maire O'Keefe, who will be famous in Ireland as the woman that, first of all, was one of the inventors of Commedia, the Irish sport, but also brought Peg Sayers to publication. She was one of the first academics and professors of modern languages female professors of modern languages in Dublin, and a feminist writer and organizer in the Gaelic League. And then my 2 favourite Moires who worked throughout the Gates period, Martin Hession, who's my great aunt, who was born just outside Galway, and got her training in the Gaelic League, and Martin Sheehan, who was born in the west of Ireland in Kerry. And the 2 of them exemplified a controversy that went on throughout the period between the different dialects of Irish that there were. Moira speaking the Connacht dialect, and Martin Sheehan speaking the Kerry Munster dialect. We also have 2 rather more severe Gaelgoers from the period. Mihalni Shukra, who was also from Kerry, is famous for writing a dictionary and was very active in the movement of standardizing Irish, which was controversial. Ricardo Fola, also a diarist and a writer, famously an agent of Irish language typewriters, involved in many controversies around the standardization of the language, what script should be used, etc. And they were active translators and active writers of plays, which were performed during the Gate period. Also just mentioned 2 actors, Maurice O'Keefe and Tiger Scannell, who, though they weren't extensive writers, have some writing behind them, and appeared on the radio with Moira in radio plays around the period. To go back a little bit further, all of these people had a background in the Gaelic League, which was founded in the early 1890s, but by the 1900s and 1910s was a mass organization bringing together cultural and political ideals of young people. When one reads around the time, many people criticized the organization for not having, or the people who joined the organization for not having as much interest in the Irish language as they might. It was perhaps a social liberation as much as a cultural phenomenon. And they were not, they revived the spoken language classes, campaigned for Irish to be a compulsory language, etc., and available for matriculation at university. They also organised plays through McLiammoir and Nash Story, and brought together many of the characters I'm talking about. Moira herself was discovered through the process of the Gaelic League, discovering talent out in the west of Ireland. There was a habit well known of visits to the Aran Islands, but also more broadly to Galway, and feis and singing and cultural competitions, which Moira won over the course of the 1910s several times. There's a picture of her there down at the bottom on the right-hand side. And she became involved in a range of cultural activities. And I think one of the important things to reference is that she came from a family that was relatively poor, but well known in singing and writing circles in Galway, and was exposed to Lady Gregory and great figures in the revival as a result of the Oireachtas. So it gave her opportunities. Not only that, she was one of 5 sisters who all won competitions. In a way, they won the X Factor of its days. Mairead, who was a major contributor to a book of Irish songs written by a woman called Eileen Costello, an English woman who had moved to Ireland, having married an Irish doctor who became involved in the League in Tuam and investigated the songs. Also, her older sister, Anya, became one of the more famous sean-nós singers of the time, forgotten now, but she was prominent on the radio during the period of the 20s and the 30s, regularly singing. There's one report that she sang even as far afield as Cardiff. During the Civil War, the cultural activities broke down, or the War of Independence and the Civil War cultural activities broke down to an extent, but one can find Moira and Mairead's teaching Irish in Galway at a school that was blown up by the Black and Tan, so they were very much affected by the period. Turning to Alfred Wilmore, we know that he became Irish, and his story is much better known in the sense that he started out as a child actor in London, and was exposed to the cultural activity of London during the period, including the Ballet Russe and the Abbey Theatre, and other aspects of Irish culture that were around at the time. He was a contemporary of Noel Coward and worked with him, and we'll come back to that in a minute. He also met and was inspired, I think, by a new McMaster who travelled extensively in Ireland and was another English-Irish man in the sense, and may have inspired him to become Irish, at least at the beginning. We know that he gave up acting and went to art school and met a woman called Maire O'Keefe, who was his muse. They not only discussed ancient Irish legends and the Irish revival that was ongoing. Under her influence, she read the Yeats's books on art in Ireland and was inspired by them. But they also read Freud and a range of other modernist books as he became an illustrator, but she inspired him to become Irish. As a result, he started doing Gaelic language lessons, and the Gaelic League was very active in London. It has as members Pádraig O'Conor. For a while, Michael Collins was there. A range of Irish people had moved over to England, and there was a very active scene there in which he learned to be Irish. And he wasn't unusual in terms of changing his name or identifying himself as Irish as part of a diaspora, even though he may not have had an Irish background. We know that there was a very active interaction, and here are some of the names. The Dolly Lynn, the woman he stayed with when he moved to Dublin, was the sister of Robert Lind, Northern Irish journalist living in London and in Highgate. He would also have met Pádraig O'Conor there. Somebody called Una O'Connor, who later became a film star, but she was in plays both in the Abbey and in London, including a production of a 1916 Rising inspired play at the Criterion in 1916. All of them were friends. A further picture here is Arnold BAKST'S, just to illustrate that moving to Ireland and becoming Irish wasn't exclusively an activity of McLiammoir. Arnold BAKST'S was a composer who for a while was Davy Byrne, an Irish poet from about 1907 to 1912. He identified as Irish and maintained a connection, even though he returned back to England. Eventually, Micheál moved to Ireland and lived in Howth, a place associated with Diarmuid and Grainne in Irish legend, where they both imagined they were reincarnations of Diarmuid and Grainne. Some say he moved to avoid the draft in 1917, but it's certainly part of the motivation. He was in plays in the Abbey and wrote a lot. He was mainly an illustrator and lived off illustrations and art of the period, where you can see a Celtic influence. It's also influenced by Jack B. Yeats at the time. We know that he was a diarist and a writer and illustrator. He wrote extensively in the Irish language throughout his life. He moved with Moira during the winter months to Davos and led a kind of Bohemian life in Europe, and was exposed, I think, to more German, Swiss, French, and Italian influences in theatre. With her, she'd moved to because she had consumption, and he went there quite regularly. He also moved to during the summer months or autumn months to Menton in the south of France, and it was there that Moira died. And he ran again into his childhood contemporaries, Noel Coward and Ivan Novello. He ran into them in the casino, and they asked him what had happened to him, why he wasn't back in the acting game, and it was that spurred him to return to Ireland. So, having returned to Ireland, I'll talk a little bit about the Irish language theatre and some of the issues that were current in the newspapers. And I should say that as an amateur, I've learned most of what I know from a review of the few books that I've read and looking through the newspapers and newspaper reports from the period. And the newspaper reports confirm the controversy that there was over actors, authors, and audience. We know that McLiammoir catalyzed some magic amongst those three elements of the theatre, but they were consistently criticised, both the actors, the authors, and the audience through the period. It was a small movement, dependent on a few enthusiasts. Sometimes the audience was small. Sometimes the actors, as amateurs, didn't have a great deal of time to rehearse. And there was an absence, one thought, of imaginative plays. And it was a difficult movement for a range of enthusiasts. Even during the period during which Micheál McLiammoir ran the theatre and directed the Irish language element of the theatre, there was this tension between translations and original work. And this touches on the internationalism versus the nativism of what was going on within the movement. One of the articles here is about one night in the Gate Theatre in 1932, where Micheál's play Lulu, which was about a modern girl, a very modern Irish girl in Galway seeking a husband, was compared with Unfor, which is a play about 1798. And there was a question around whether, what was the appropriate focus? Are we looking at modern plays about modern life and how realistic are they, or are we looking into history? And when we look to fill the gaps that there are in Irish literature, where should we look? Should we look to translating foreign works, or should we look to generating those ourselves? There's always a continuing issue. The play was filled with figures like, the group was filled with figures from the Civil War, the winning side of the Civil War in the Free State during the 20s, and had received a grant. So there's an amount of resentment as to how much money it was getting. And it was actually at the same time as the Abbey in receipt of a public subsidy, which at this time was greater than that of the Abbey. You also had the tensions that I kind of briefly mentioned between the different bits of the language, Munster dialect, Connacht's dialect, whether the theatre itself could serve Ireland and Irish-speaking Ireland as far away as it was in Dublin. And indeed, that's one of the issues that led to the foundation of the Gate, the foundation of Untitled, and a question, why not Cork? Because there's a definite regional and dialectic element to the theatre, or demands on the theatre. A couple of other things, just reviewing through the paper, is in terms of founding the state, the Irish language hadn't been presented in a literary form for almost 300 years. And so there's a great effort to publish books, both original books and translated books. And again, similarly to in the theatre, a lot of controversy over whether older works were being revived and or younger works translated. So the Angoom, the state publisher, which published both plays and books, was constantly in the press, or very regularly in the press, being praised for some of its output, but also criticised for the quality of and the focus of what it was publishing. You can see there, War of the Worlds and The Hound of the Basket Bills was published at least as much as some of the older books, such as Peg Sayers or Wilmore and Sale, old Irish books. The radio was also extant in the period. It began in 1926, and from the beginning, it attempted to promote the Irish language. Maire Hession herself had a regular program teaching Irish and telling stories with children, where she worked with Maire O'Keefe. She was also in, it's been reported, the first Irish play, Spreading the News, or dell'arte, by Lady Gregory in 1933. But I found reference to a broadcast of a play by Chekhov, The Proposal, in Irish, as early as 1931. But certainly from the beginning of the radio station, there was an output that was Irish language and theatrical output as well. During the period, Anya, Maire's sister, was regularly on as a singer. We also have, during the period, a lot of discussion about film. Obviously, the first thing being the introduction of the talkies around 1929 impacted the theatre and the view as to whether the theatre could survive as a result of talkies, and an influence on how McLiammoir and Hilton Edwards spoke as to what the theatre should be doing, how realistic it should be, what style it should be in reaction to the film. So it was a challenge. I just think in these COVID days, I found an interesting article which suggested that plays could be broadcast across a distance in the United States. So even then, there was an aspect that there could be remote performance. And it is a very current topic, what exactly the reaction to the film industry might be. In that, there are also, while there were challenges, there were influences, and I think you'll see in the plays that I'm going to finish with that some of the imagery and the way of presenting material in films finds reflections in some of the plays. Doubtless plays I haven't read, but certainly some that in the Irish language that I have looked at. McLiammoir himself was, like Eva Novello and Noel Carrot, a film star of sorts. In early 1925, he was involved in an Irish film, Land of Her Fathers, which wasn't terribly successful. And he certainly, I think, modelled himself on some of the matinee idols of the period, in terms at least of the theatre publicity that was going on. Another aspect that I think is really interesting is the social life that was going on in the background. We have multiple reports of the garden parties and Gaelic League ceilidhs. I often wonder whether the crowds overlapped, the Gate crowd and the Gaeilgeoir crowd. It seems to have at points, but it was there was an active cultural life there. There's a description of McLiammoir entering a party with Orson Welles, dressed as a mermaid and singing Millie the Messy Old Mermaid. There are stories of the Irish TD, Esmond, landing his airplane in the middle of the Gate Garden party. So if it wasn't exactly the Roaring 20s, there were aspects of of a glamorous social life and a sense of adventure. Looking now at the plays, it's quite an eclectic mix. The first kind of strands one might look at it is Molière, a translation from the French classic comedy theatre. There are several of Molière's plays presented at the Gate Theatre, directed by McLiammoir, and they were well received and are part of an attempt to bring French literature into Irish, almost in preference to English literature. What can be said about that? Well, let me see. We'll move on to another French play, again with a filmic instance. A play in League, or The Bells, by Erckmann Chatrain, about a man who's murdered a Jewish guy 15 years before, being overcome by guilt at the sound of bells. This performance in 1933 was a very popular play and repeated many times. It was also made into a film at the time. We also have Spanish plays, Martinez Sierra from the Spanish art tradition. Here a scene from Wife of a Famous Man, about a famous man with a long-suffering wife, produced in Galway and in Dublin in 1934. Was a great hit and gave an opportunity for some grand staging. The reviews at the time described the filmic staging of the laundry room and the famous man, the pilot's, Jose Maria's grand return from his epic journeys. There were other Spanish plays as well, by Martinez Sierras and also by Quintero, all of them popular. These were chosen perhaps because they had a different sensibility from other plays in what I read. That they were feminist in their way, and they had found a realism, and that was a kind of a romantic realism that I think attracted McLiammoir. Moving on, another aspect of this is that the plays were probably brought to the Irish stage through the work of Henry Barker Grenville, who worked with George Bernard Shaw and was his kind of chosen actor for a while. He left George Bernard Shaw and began a process of translating Spanish plays, having worked at the court. So there's a kind of a connection there, I think. There was an attempt to bring modern life to life in the Irish language. Lulu, a farce about I think I mentioned it before, about a modern girl with a bob looking for a husband. By McLiammoir, a very popular play, though most of the Irish language reviews suggest that these women are very unlikely to be found in Galway. There were historic dramas delving into the historic past. So on Bancroide, set in the early 1700s, which Moira played a hero who had to choose between a native and a landlord in romantically. On Danner, set in the Middle Ages, or set in Viking Dublin, a similar romantic drama. On Baldove, one set during the 1867 rebellion. No pictures for those. But I'm going to finish on two plays, one of which is the iconic Diarmuid and Grainne. And this was the play that inspired Micheál the most in the early period, and it was the opening play in Untitled. The 1933 production, pictured here, there's the chorus, is was done by McLiammoir, and Moira Hession and Micheál were the romantic leads. The play is very perhaps old-fashioned in the sense that it's melodramatic. The language is quite overblown in some senses, but it was very much recognized and loved at the time, and has been repeated many times. The reviews comment on the costumes, not always favorably. Here the Fianna fighting one another in respect of over Grainne. It was said, I think this is by Mary Manning, that Diarmuid and Grainne was encouraging after standards that had flickered low, and the pageant, while it was dramatic, perhaps overwhelmed the art. There was a particular criticism of Grainne's get-up, and why the Fianna had to be represented as tidy, woolly-haired, shaggy ragbags. The story is well known in Ireland. We learned it at school. It's one of the older man, Finn McCool, losing his intended betrothed to a younger man, Diarmuid, who will not sleep with her out of loyalty to the older man, and Grainne entreaties him to make good and to sleep with her. And the dramatic tension is in and around Diarmuid's loyalty. For those of you that remember the book at Irish school, I know you're not all Irish, there's a famous scene where Grainne throws water on her thighs and says, "This water is braver than you, Diarmuid." And we all, certainly as schoolboys, were amused by that. The play rather turns it around, as McLiammoir's Diarmuid asks Grainne to remove his sword from the sheath lying close to his thigh in a kind of tense section. There was an English language version of the play done earlier in 1929 and 1931. It's interesting in that Lady Gregory loved it. She went to see it. She preferred it rather than preferred it to what was going on in the Abbey that night. She herself had written a play, Diarmuid and Grainne, which was never performed, perhaps because it was close to her personal life, or exposed something in her personal life. She had married a much older man and had famously had an affair with a younger man. But she, on the back of this, invited McLiammoir finally to meet Yeats, which he did after the play. The play was first performed in Untitled in Galway at the invitation of Liam O'Brien, and it's what launched McLiammoir and Hilton Edwards' career. McLiammoir was engaged to do the play off the back of a new McMaster's, working with a new McMaster, and he got Hilton Edwards involved and Coco Daisy Bernard in the production. Again, there were costume issues. Certainly inspired by BAKST'S or by a romantic movement. The costumes were very dramatic. They were well received. But at a meeting of the theatre group afterwards, there were complaints about Finn McCool, who was played by Liam O'Brien, his costume being quite low cut and rather too revealing.
Sorry, Martin, Patrick, just quickly to give you just a 1 minute warning, please.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, we'll skip that. The final play I just wanted to talk about, and we are there, is Arms and the Man by George Bernard Shaw. So the first translation of George Bernard Shaw into Irish, which was considered a brave undertaking, given that it relies on complex language and wit. It was played by Moira opposite Cathal O'Keefe, and again well received. It's about a romantic woman who has her romantic notions challenged by her chocolate soldier, and again a very well received play, the first George Bernard Shaw play in Irish. I mention it in some ways because the scenery design, and I'll kind of finish on this, was done by Orson Welles, and we all know that Orson Welles had arrived into Ireland in 1931. He was also briefly, it said, attracted by the Irish language and asked Liam O'Brien whether he could join Untitled and learn Irish, but apparently the money was not enough, or money wasn't offered depending on the story. But he did spend time in the Aran Islands in the 30s and returned to the gate of the theatre, getting a job in the theatre. It's said as an actor, but what's forgotten is that his first job was actually to paint the scenery of Arms of the Man. I think I'll leave it at that. So there was a little bit of a jaunt through some of the productions and some of the issues in the Irish theatre. Thank you very much.
It's great. Thanks a million, Martin. Absolutely fascinating stuff there. And I think what you've really shown us is, I mean, you know, you said at the start, obviously, that some of this has been written about before, but I think what you've really shown us brilliantly is how much more still has to be written and uncovered and discovered. And you know, I can really imagine this presentation inspiring future PhDs in books and much more besides. Let's hope. So look, we have plenty of time for discussion. I'm going to give us maybe about 10 minutes for discussion before we take a break before our next session. So as Sarah has just popped into the chat there, we're now open for questions and comments in the chat. So again, maybe for people who came in late, we're going to do this. If you want to make a comment or ask a question, you can do one of two things. You can either put your name in the chat to indicate that you want to speak over the camera, or you can type your comment in the chat and I will read it out and put it to Ian and or Martin for you. So while you're just gathering your thoughts, maybe thinking about the questions you might like to ask, just to look ahead for the rest of the day. So our schedule is on the Eventbrite page that you would have used to book your tickets for this. So do check in there. We're going to put a link back to that in the chat for you as well. At 1 o'clock, we have a session on Joe Vanek, the designer, brilliant designer, who recently, of course, donated his archive to NUI Galway. Then later today, we will also have a panel discussion about moral laverty, and really looking forward to that one. Brilliant discussion of a playwright associated with the Gate, but badly forgotten. And then we finish at 5 o'clock today with Joan Dean's keynote. So I do hope you'll be able to join us for those events throughout the day. So let me now, I can see people offering congratulations in the chat, but would anybody like to make a comment or ask a question? Okay. And very good. Okay. And Grace has just helpfully told us that the schedule on Eventbrite is CET rather than GMT. So we'll need to bear that in mind as well. Okay. So I'm going to ask Marianne Kennedy to come in first, please. Go ahead, Marianne.
Hello to you both, and thank you so much for really wonderful and fascinating papers. And as Patrick has rightly mentioned, very inspirational to future scholarship, absolutely. And I think they really, just wanted to have a quick point of information to Martin on A.D. Niver Hertig's book about Diarmuid, where she goes through the very beginning of the outline of the first plays in the Irish language. So you might just be interested in that. I just wanted to say that. That's all. Thank you very, very much so to both of you.
Yeah, and also relevant, I think, for Martin is that we have a comment from Charlotte Perkins, who says that she enjoyed the comment on Lulu, and the reviewer saying there weren't any women in Ireland like that, or even Galway. I don't know about that. I mean, Galway tends to throw up all sorts of surprises, but yeah, I mean, Martin, I don't know if you want to come back on that about Lulu and the extent to which it might have been seen as unusual for its time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a lot of my interest in this is personal. I'm quite fascinated in those Hessian women that were born in a 3-room cottage and ended up on the stage. They're not much talked about in our family, and I wonder whether it was embarrassment or maybe that they weren't very good. But it turns out they got good reviews. They were certainly more modern than some of the descriptions I got about them were. So I think within the movement there was I think it was a liberation for many women. Like my great aunts became teachers, became actors, became radio presenters as a result of their X factors, I call it, bobbed their hair. And I imagine there might have been an amount of disapproval. Certainly in the articles, there was a question of whether this was really Gaelicus or foreign or not. So you see that throughout the the discussions of these strong women, were they really realistic or real? And then more perhaps more significantly, that there was a real struggle to represent modern life through Irish. Historical plays were fine, plays set in the Gaeltacht were fine, but there was an effort to try and have a modern soap opera, and I think there were tensions with that, because Irish language in Dublin didn't seem realistic to some, and these women in Galway didn't seem realistic to others.
Interesting, yeah. So there's obviously, again, a lot there, I think. I'm going to take two questions for Ian together because they're somewhat interrelated. So the first is from Max Kane, who asks what it is about Commedia that appeals to both Irish people and the LGBT community. And then JP McMahon asks about the reception of McLiammoir's plays with overtly gay characters and how they were received in Ireland. So Ian, lots there, I think, but do you want to try that one?
Yeah, I'll start with JP's if that's okay. So it wasn't really an event. It was well received, but it wasn't really particularly celebrated, the piece, and it wasn't the fact that there was a gay man on stage talking about his desires, etc. Interestingly enough, was not really commented on or was not perceived as shocking, etc. I think a really interesting part is that there's this really long document in the Gate Digital Archive, and I probably should have said that all my images pretty much were from the digital archive that we have at NUI Galway. But in there, there's a kind of a notes basically by Hilton Edwards on McLiammoir's script, and in that, Edwards himself shows kind of a fear that I think the play will be okay because you're not showing anything. And I think what's really interesting is that play is a very talky play. There's very little actual physicality in it. And I think that maybe something there about, you know, not kind of showing any kind of, there's a reticence or there's a fear there, I think, within even the structure of the play, and the kind of text that is there underlying everything is all about this ballet dancer, and to have a play about a ballet dancer that doesn't really move is kind of interesting in itself. So that's why I kind of read it as that he's more the Piero figure, even though he's never described as such, even though he's trying to be the Harlequin. That was my kind of take on it. Which brings me to the second question, I guess. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating to me. I mean, that the Commedia, I could really thank my own PhD student, Juliana Balaz, on this, that she is very much looking at Yeats in relation to kind of queer frameworks, and it came up that she kind of pushed me in this direction of how the Commedia itself is quite queered in a lot of things, and how it was very much anti-church, I guess, initially, and then taken on board, you know, particularly as I wrote about, I guess, with the Piero figure and the Harlequin, as being that kind of space. I guess it's just the overt theatricality of the Commedia, the fact that it has these costumes and masks, etc., mean that, you know, the really interesting thing about McLiammoir and Edwards was how they were able to essentially kind of hide in plain sight, have this gay identity, overt gay identity, in this very repressed conservative Ireland, and because of their theatrical nature, their theatricality as people, I guess, that allowed them have that freedom. Freedom may be too far a word, too far a stretch, but yeah, I think it's the overt theatricality, I guess, you know, that allowed it and that attracts kind of a queer following of sorts, in the same way that, you know, musical theatre, its overt kind of theatricality, even though the plots might be very heteronormative of musical theatre, again attracts kind of a gay following as well. So hopefully that somewhat answers that question.
Yeah, great stuff there. Okay, Janine Woods wants to come in. We got you, Janine. So, okay, so Janine, we might give Janine a chance there just to turn on her mic and ask a question, but before that, I might just, or have we heard? Yeah, I can hear.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, there's a bit of interference, Janine, but go ahead and we'll do our best to hear you.
Oh, okay, thanks very much. I loved both papers, but Martin, I really, I thought your work was wonderful. I think one of the things that happens with with scholarship of is that the Irish language theatre gets somewhat hived off from studies of English language theatre. So that what you've done to look at the overlaps is very interesting. I think it brings a lot to light that maybe doesn't get enough attention. But I just had a couple of very kind of random questions. One of them was Lulu, the drama Lulu. Certainly the photograph, I don't know if you know anything about this, but the character as she presented there looks very like Louise Brooks. Wondering if there's any kind of influence there. And the other, this is again very random, your romance Oniony Hession, in one of the newspaper cuttings there as Mrs. John Keane. Do you have a relationship with John Keane? Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so I hope, I can see Martin is nodding, so I hope you got some of that. Janine, just to let you know, bit of interference there. You sound rather like a kind of submarine commander in the Atlantic during World War II, but I think we got most of it, I hope. So Martin, as I saw you were nodding there, do you want to come back on those from Janine?
On the Lulu connection, I really do want to explore that. The play itself, I'd love to get to your archive and read it because it's there. I've seen reports of it. I don't think the play is about a thoroughly modern women with fighting over a romance with a Balkan prince. I think it's more of a light comedy than the Louise Brooks Lulu, but the connections are fascinating in the sense that she was the quintessential bobbed flapper or whatever. The Lulu films themselves are quite dark, but the name is there in a lot of McLiammoir's writings. He describes in one of his books a Lulu that he definitely doesn't like at a party. So I was just interested in drawing those connections. I haven't. On the Oniony or Ethniony Hession and her relationship, John Keane or O'Cahan, he was a local farmer from a singing family as well. So she married quite young in around 1911. And they had many children. And I often wonder whether they're related to the Keane family from Carlisle, which is where they're from. But it was her sister married into that family, and they're also quite well known in traditional music circles. That's as much as I know.
Okay, great. I'm going to give last question then to Maire O'Keefe. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So she writes, many thanks for both papers, very interesting. She has a question for Ian. Her own research at the moment is on French cabaret, late 19th century, and its links with socialism and anarchism. Wondering if the Commedia influence was linked with any political movements in Ireland at that time.
Yeah, thank you, Morag. I guess Elaine Sisson has written on this in relation to a figure that Mark already mentioned, which is Toto Cogley's cabaret, and also Nicholas Allen has written about the cabaret as well, and they've kind of linked it, I guess, to somewhat to kind of Republican politics, etc. as well in that sphere. I guess the attraction of cabaret, as you've probably found in your own research, I guess for me and the Commedia influence as well, trying to understand it, might be. I guess first of all, there's kind of an alternative space to live differently. The cabaret kind of turns things on its head, etc. It's got that kind of carnivalesque aspect to it, but it's also maybe that thing that Edwards talked about in that quote that I gave when he was with the Cabaret Kittens, where he talked about that kind of connection. I think between the audience, the breaking down of the boundaries between the audience and the performers in a way that cabaret, as far as I understand it, was essentially kind of you're invited into this shared space of theatricality where you can imagine things differently. And I think that again allowed for these alternative identities. You know, it's very interesting looking at all of those people in kind of in the UK and in London, etc., involved in the Gaelic League and so on, how in a way, and you know, Ivor Walsh, I guess, has written about this in relation to McLiammoir and Wilde, etc., that, you know, Irishness itself was kind of almost a queer identity at that time, and coming out of the Wilde trials, etc., you know, how so I guess all of that's in the mix, and in these cabarets is encouraging that mix of different and alternative identities and ways to live. So I think that yes, It's an area that's been very much underexplored. I think is something I'm very interested in myself, is kind of popular theatre. And that idea, I guess, of cabaret, and more generally, if we use the word carnival to include Commedia, I guess, within that, certainly been looked at very well in relation to the Irish novel, the idea of the carnivalesque, but not actually, interestingly, so much in actual performances of carnivalesque performances that are rooted in some of those traditions in Ireland. You know, Austin Clarke wrote plays that were based on the Commedia as well, and they've had little attention as well. So there is definitely a current of this work happening, that just it needs to be further explored. So yeah, I'd encourage that. But I think there definitely was a political element to it, I think as well. Yeah.
Great. Well, look, we better leave it at that because it's heading towards 11:30. I'm sure people want to stretch their legs, get coffee or whatever. So let me just again remind you to return here at 1 o'clock for our talk about Joe Vanek, where we're going to hear from Elaine and Grace. The full conference timetable is in the chat, so thanks, Sarah, for posting that. But and we also have a comment there from Marianne from Martin, so I'll draw that to your attention, Martin. So look, anyway, it's been great to get off to such a good start. These have been 2 fantastic papers, loads of great information, fantastic archival stuff in there too. So thank you very much to Ian and to Martin and to all of you for joining us. We'll see you all very soon.